Welcome to lesson number 2 in our series on the 7 deadly sins. Today we look at the sin of anger. As I start, I'm going to ask kind of a simple and maybe even funny, but maybe potentially dangerous type of question, and just ask you to think for a moment of a pet peeve of yours. One of those things that just really gets under your skin and just kind of gnaws at you. I'll kind of offer one by saying that mine, because I do, when I'm doing a lot of driving on the road, mine is drivers who stay in the left lane on a 4-lane highway, especially when they get up next to another vehicle, and instead of passing, they take forever to go by, or they just hang out in that left hand lane. And especially if when I finally get around them, I notice that they are on their cell phone. That's just one of those things that just really gets me, and it's gotten me all the time that I've been driving, as those folks are just oblivious to everything else going on. Now, on a more serious note, I want you to think of a time when you got truly angry at another person. And I want you to think about that time. What did you say or do to that person? What was the situation that caused it? Who was that person? What was their relationship to you? Did you later regret what you said or did? How do you feel about it now? Is it something that you are still angry about, especially maybe something that happened a long time ago? Is it something that you're still angry about and that you still struggle with? The word anger is itself a bit tricky, because we may use that word as we use a lot of different words. We may use that word to describe a variety of feelings along a spectrum. We may use the word anger when the reality is really closer to, we're just kind of temporarily upset about something. I was so angry that when I went to pick up my order that the restaurant had messed up my order. Or I waited there and that waiter never came back and got my order right or got my order at all. And we're not really angry. We're just kind of upset. It's maybe one of those kind of pet peeves. It's something that kind of gets us at the moment. And we have kind of that initial rush of feeling or emotion, but it's not something that really significantly impacts our life. It's not something that's longer term. It's not something that we dwell upon. It's just there in the moment. And then we use the word anger, and I think this is where, when we're talking about the context of a deadly sin, this is more where it is that deep-seated feeling, that feeling down in the center of your being. That big emotional and maybe physical response to being harmed, or the threat of harm, whether it's physical or emotional or mental or spiritual harm. Anger is listed among the 7 deadly sins because, as with the other sins, the sin of pride, and that was looked at in the first lesson and in the others that will come up, it can eat us up from the inside if we let it. It can be easy to hold on to anger, to hold on to that grudge. And the danger is that anger keeps us at the darkest points of that situation. It traps us from being able to move on with our lives. And if we allow that anger to remain unresolved, it can transmute into bitterness and hard-heartedness, not just towards that particular situation, but to other situations. It can cause us to generalize other situations, to compare it to that. It can make us hard-hearted and bitter towards other people as well. It spills over, you see, from that particular situation and becomes a daily attitude. And if we're not careful, that anger, that type of anger can infect every other part of our being and our soul until it dominates and controls us. And we find ourselves just being people filled with anger instead of being filled with caring and compassion. A monk by the name of Evagrius is one who I mentioned in the first lesson, who identified what he called the 8 passions, and the 8 passions were what the 7 deadly sins eventually kind of came out of in the midst of that. He called pride the most severe of the passions because of the overarching nature of pride that can be seen in so many other aspects of our life. But while he said that pride is the most severe, he said the most fierce passion is anger. The most fierce passion. There's an intensity to anger that can be greater than the others. It can be more explosive. And it doesn't take much expression of that anger for it to cause damage to relationships, to say or do things that we will later regret. I saw a great thing that said, a speech made in anger is the greatest speech you will ever regret. It feels so good in that moment to let that out and to explode, but we don't realize that we can cause permanent damage in relationships. And so while pride may be the most severe and the most overarching of the 7 deadly sins, anger may be the most explosive of the 7 deadly sins. So let's look at a few scriptures about anger. Proverbs always has good things to say. In Proverbs 29:11, the writer says, a fool gives full vent to anger, but the wise quietly holds it back. Well, it says it pretty directly, doesn't it? A fool is one who gives vent to that anger, and especially that unrestrained anger, who just kind of lets it go and lets it out. And I think we have to all admit that at one time or another, we've had those times where we've all been pretty foolish, where instead of exercising control, it says gives full vent, we just let it all out and let it go, and then later had to go back and repent for what we had done. Proverbs 30:33 says, for as pressing milk produces curds and pressing the nose produces blood, so pressing anger produces strife. Strife and conflict, and by extension damage and potential brokenness in relationships, comes when we refuse to let up. When we keep pressing forward in our anger instead of letting go. We know the more we press on it, the more we push, eventually something gives way. And just as if we keep pressing on that nose, and it's almost kind of like a punching of the nose, the pressing is like a punching that leads to a low breathe. That constant kind of pounding in that conflict and out of that anger leads to strife. In the book of Ephesians, Paul says in Ephesians 4:26-27, be angry, but do not sin. And do not let the sun go down on your anger. And do not make room for the devil. Now, I really like this one. The other was on Proverbs, but I really like this one because Paul acknowledges that anger is a human emotion. Sometimes we can't help but be angry. And the truth of the matter is that there are times in which we should be angry. When we observe injustice around us, when somebody has been harmed and it doesn't seem like there is justice for that person. But how we respond to that anger, I think, is what Paul is getting at. Be angry, but do not sin. How we respond to that anger determines whether that anger can be constructive or destructive, whether it takes hold and allows us to go down negative and dark paths, or whether it causes us to do something good. And if you're listening, I'm kind of already giving you a few little antidotes and remedies for anger. Paul warns against holding on to anger. And he says, don't sin. Be angry, but do not sin. And don't let the sun go down on your anger. In other words, don't hold on to it. Don't let it dominate everything. In doing premarital counseling, or not premarital counseling, but actually marital counseling, and in talking with couples who have lived for a long time, I've had people say, well, we never went to bed angry at each other. But what I really like, and I think the most honest answer, is the way I heard one couple put it. They said, we've never gone to bed angry with each other. Of course, we've had times where we didn't sleep for 4 days, but we never went to bed angry. I think that's closer to the truth. I can't really say that either is truth for my wife and me. And as of the speaking of this, we've been together for 36 years, and we've been married almost 36 years. We've been married a little over 34. We've gone to bed angry. We've had times where we were angry at each other. But what I can say is that over the course of time, and then really pretty early in our relationship, we realized that it didn't do us any good. And that if there was something that was making us angry, we needed to address it quickly. Because it didn't take long to realize that holding on to that anger didn't help either one of us, and it didn't help our relationship. So we have worked over the years, whenever there is something that makes the other person angry, to try to resolve it as quickly as possible with minimal hurt and maximum respect for the other. But then I think is powerful, let me put it that way. What Paul says is that admonition to don't make room for the devil. Holding on to that anger, you see, crowds out God, and in that void in which God is crowded out, it creates a space for bitterness and hard-heartedness and even hate. Don't make room for the devil. Don't have an attitude of heart that crowds out God and makes space for evil to reside in your heart, focusing on the spite and the disgust and the pain and hurt. If you become angry, try to resolve it as quickly as possible so that there's no space for that sin to enter. There's no space for that type of emotion and hurt to take root and grow within and begin to crowd out God and others even more so. James 1:19 and 20 puts it this way. You must understand this, my beloved brothers and sisters. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. For human anger does not produce God's righteousness. Oh, I like that one. We've all probably heard the axiom that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should be quick we should listen twice as much as we speak. We should be quick to listen, James says. Quick to understand is what he's getting. Quick to pay attention and slow to speak. Slow to offer that remedy. Slow to say what's on our mind. Remember in Proverbs he says the wise quietly holds it back. It's that same type of thing. In taking time to listen, we are trying to truly consider and understand the other person instead of just firing off our thoughts in a rant or in a tirade. So as we hear these scriptures, I think we begin to see some of these different dangers to sin and even the possible remedies. But let's look at them more specifically. The first danger to anger is that it focuses on the conflict instead of focusing on trying to work towards reconciliation and forgiveness. Now, the truth of the matter is that sometimes we hold on to that anger because if we think that if we let go of that anger and if we move towards forgiveness, then somehow we're letting the other person get away with it. I've heard people tell me that over the years, that, but if I forgive them, then it'll make them feel like that they just got away with something they shouldn't have done. We justify, you see, that anger by saying, but yes, I know I need to forgive, but what that person did or said to me or said to somebody else was wrong, and they need to know that. That may be a true statement of fact, but holding on to the anger and not finding a way to resolve it keeps us in that moment. It keeps us in that moment. Remember, that was also in the past, that moment that has gone by, instead of trying to figure out how to carry on with our daily living. And when we focus on that pain and we focus on what's come in the past, we can't really work towards healing and wholeness and mercy and forgiveness. We sometimes hold on to that anger so that we can feel more justified about how we feel and justify that anger, and maybe even justify or excuse what we have said or done. And letting go of that need for the conflict seems like we're giving up somehow the moral high ground. But nothing could be further from the truth. Letting go of that anger allows us to move on and allows us to not make that room for the devil. A second danger of the sin of anger is that it invades our thoughts and heart, and it makes it hard to concentrate on what we are doing. Have you ever been in that state of anger where you were in there and you were letting that stuff take hold? You just can't think about other things. I've always said I'm the king of imagined conversations. You know what I'm talking about with that? where there's something that's a potential conflict or something that's been said or a disagreement, and I imagine all these different types of potential conversations and how they might go. And I've allowed myself to just get in a real state of worry and anxiety way in advance of that meeting with that other person. And I've imagined me telling them off or them telling me off and me telling them off in return or all those sorts of things. When the reality is that truly the vast majority of the time it never goes like that at all. And that when I try to tone down instead of ramp up, when I try to tone down by in my speech and not responding, instead of trying to ramp up the situation with a rant or some sort of tirade, what I've discovered is the conversations go far different. But see, when I get caught up in that anger, I start focusing on what has happened, and I can't think about other things. I can't concentrate about other things. It constantly comes in, and then I find myself being short in dealing with other people. So it makes it hard to concentrate. We replay that anger in our minds and in our hearts. A third danger is, of course, that anger separates us from God and from one another. Because it's not until we can let go of that anger, not until we can move towards forgiveness and potentially reconciliation. And I say potentially when it comes to reconciliation, because the other person may not be in a state where they want reconciliation. But we'll talk in a moment about forgiveness and how forgiveness involves us and an attitude we have. But if we stay in that state and damage that relationship with God and others, then there's that barrier to forgiveness, and we are unable to move forward and to either forgive or to be able to maybe even hopefully reconcile. A fourth danger is that anger makes that room for the devil. It makes room for bitterness and hate. It crowds out what is good and loving. Anger keeps us in that state of agitation. It keeps us stirred up. There's a detective show that was in the 90s, and one of the cops had a problem with his anger and him lashing out, and people were trying to help, and he said, "I know, but I just get stirred up," and that's how he always described it. I try not to get stirred up. And it was a way of him talking about how he dealt with that anger in the short term and the long term. And that's how it is when we're angry, we're in that state of agitation, we're stirred up. And it's stirred towards that fear and that worry and that injustice, or that perceived injustice or that hurt or that pain, instead of moving towards understanding and forgiveness and trying to have a sense of calm and peace in our heart. Instead of calming down, we stay stirred up. And the more we stay stirred up and in that state of agitation, it infects all of our relationships. We're unable to move on for that. We're unable to see the good. We're unable to recognize the good in others. We keep looking for the wrong that someone has done for us. And even in other relationships, we keep looking for that wrong. Well, how are they going to disappoint me? How are they going to make me mad? How are they going to cause me hurt? Instead of going into that relationship with expectation and hope and looking for the best. So those are some of the primary dangers of this sin of anger. And it's what makes it so deadly, is that when we're in this, we're just like this all the time, internally and then often externally. And you may have, again, heard me allude to some of these things, but let's look at what some of the remedies are for anger. The first is the most obvious, and I've already mentioned it on multiple occasions, and that is forgiveness. Now, forgiveness involves letting go of a grudge, letting go of a hurt or pain or something that was done for you. As I said earlier, it can be difficult because sometimes in that forgiveness, we are tempted to feel like we are letting that person off the hook. But the truth of the matter is that forgiveness really isn't about the other person, it's about you. When you forgive, you are letting yourself off the hook. You are not allowing that person or that situation to control you any longer, to invade your thoughts, to keep you stirred up in that agitation, to damage that relationship with them and with God. I saw a great line many years ago, and it's one of my favorites because it says it so well. It says that the refusal to forgive is like drinking poison, like you drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. When we fail to forgive, when we stay stirred up and in that state of agitation, when we give in and we give full vent to that anger, we suffer much more than the person who may have wronged us or that situation that caused that anger. Again, it's understandable and even acceptable, I think, to be angry about injustice. There are times where it's okay to be angry, but Paul says don't sin. In other words, don't hold on to that anger. Don't let the sun go down. Work towards forgiveness. Don't refuse to work towards forgiveness. Don't live in such a state and an attitude that it damages your own soul. Because that refusal to forgive and that holding on to anger causes damage to your soul, not to the soul of the other person, and it causes danger to your soul over the course of a long run and maybe even eternity, when the actual offense may have only been temporary and a long time ago. Well, along those lines is another remedy to anger is to try to the best of your ability to put yourself in that person's shoes, to try to understand. It's not acceptable. It's not saying that what that person did was acceptable. It's not saying that that circumstance was okay. But it seeks to understand at a deeper level why that person might have done what they did, or why that situation may have arisen as it did. Are there extenuating circumstances that don't justify the action, but may help you understand what led the person to do what he or she did that made you so angry? Putting yourself in someone else's shoes helps diffuse the anger because you recognize, well, maybe and most likely they were acting out of their own hurt. They were acting out of their own pain. And it might have been that you were just collateral damage or you were just the nearest target. Putting yourself in somebody else's shoes also helps you think about your own issues. It helps you think about your own hurts, your own areas of pain, what it is that triggers that fear and that anxiety and that hurt and that pain within you. It helps you think about ways in which you may have responded badly. You might have responded in a way that caused hurt to somebody else and something that you later regretted. But maybe in that moment you were too embarrassed to admit, or maybe too embarrassed or ashamed to ask for forgiveness from that other person. Putting yourself in another person's shoes, again, doesn't justify what the situation is. But it does help you take a step back and analyze the situation instead of being constantly caught up in the anger of that moment, reliving that over and over and over again. That makes that space and that leads to a more permanent condition that infects your soul and infects eventually your relationships with others. Well, the third remedy then is to take direct action for good, even if you don't necessarily feel like it. If you're angry over an injustice, then get angry about it, but find a way that you can bring good out of that. Do something good for another person. Use your faith and your abilities and to counteract that situation that may have made you angry. The great man of faith and creator of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Fred Rogers, said that when he was a boy, that his mother would always tell him that in difficult times and times of strife, look for the helpers. In other words, look for the people who are working to bring about good in the midst of bad situations. When we're angry, we kind of find ourselves like that. We find ourselves noticing everything that is wrong, complaining about what is wrong, moving towards bitterness and hate towards that other person. But when we resolve to do something good, we can repay evil, as Paul says, with good. Instead of repaying evil with evil, we repay evil with good. And part of enacting, so how do we go about doing those things? Well, one is resolving to take action. But I think it all starts with prayer. praying for that person who made you angry, praying to understand at a deeper level than beyond the surface situation. Helps us move towards that understanding and that forgiveness. Prayer helps us calm down our hearts. It helps us turn it over to God. It helps us see beyond the initial hurt and the anger. A monk by the name of Abba Nihilus said, prayer is the seed of gentleness and the absence of anger. When we go before God in prayer, we offer that, we release it, we let it go, and we give it to Him. If you can truly pray for someone who has made you hurt, who has hurt you or made you angry, then you're on the path to true forgiveness and healing. And that doesn't necessarily come about immediately. It may not come out in a matter of hours. You may go to bed angry. The sun may go down on your anger, but what Paul is talking about in the midst of that, he's talking about that long-lasting situation. But when you pray for somebody and you resolve to try to bring good out of that situation, then it moves you towards forgiveness and towards healing. Anger, I agree with the monk Evagrius that anger can be the most fierce of all the passion of the 7 deadly sins. And left unresolved, it can lead to bitterness and hate in our heart. And that bitterness and hate in our heart will eventually manifest itself in a variety of different ways in our relationships with others. It will affect how we look with our head. It will affect how we interpret things that come our way. Instead of looking with expectation and hope and love and compassion and mercy, we look with angerness and hate and suspicion and fear. If we allow space for that anger in our heart, it's going to manifest in our words and our deeds and our overall attitude. However, when we rise above our anger, when we acknowledge our anger and try to move beyond it, then we can be a powerful witness for Christ. We can exhibit the calm and the mercy of Christ. Because, in part, we know how explosive and dangerous anger can be. So here's kind of that final question. What are you going to allow? What are you going to choose to allow to dominate your heart, your mind, your attitude, your words, your deeds, your daily walk in life in this world? Are you going to let that fear and that pain and that hurt of anger dominate and infect every other part of your life? Or are you going to work towards forgiveness? Are you going to work towards understanding and compassion? Are you going to repay evil for good and allow God's forgiveness and God's healing to be present in your life and in this world? Well, thank you for joining with me today. And the next lesson is going to be on avarice and envy. And I hope that you will join me for that lesson. If you are watching this in real time, meaning that as I'm recording it during the month of September of 2024, just a reminder that on September the 18th and September the 25th, we will not have any in-person Bible study. A reminder for those who may be watching it that I offer an in-person Bible study on Wednesday nights at 5:30 at Cleveland First United Methodist Church. But on the 18th and the 25th, the 2 Wednesday nights after this, we will have only a video lesson. I will be on a trip, but we'll record a lesson that will go online before I leave. 2 lessons that'll go online before I leave for that trip. So thank you for joining with me, and look for those online. God bless you. Have a great day.